Greetings, students, and welcome to our next lecture entitled Other Ethical Perspectives from the Early Modern Period, Part 2. I'm Dr. T. Let's get started. All right, so in this lecture, we'll be looking at the ideas of Thomas Hobbes in relation to ethics, okay? Again, Hobbes actually provides us with another ethical perspective from the early modern period to consider. Now, although we're being introduced to his works now as far as ethics, in a coming unit, we'll actually be looking at his socio-political ideas and reading his work directly, okay? However, his ethics are important because, well, number one, we're in this particular unit and section right now, but his ethics also lay the foundation for his future socio-political work, okay? So let's jump in. First question, as always, who is Thomas Hobbes, okay? Hobbes was an English philosopher. He was born in 1588. He's most known for his political theory, which again, we will cover later this semester, but he also had very strong views on ethical egoism. And basically, his ethical egoism laid the foundation for his socio-political ideas. Now, that being said, we've learned about Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, sentimentalism. What is ethical egoism? Ethical egoism, loosely defined, is the idea that I should or ought to do that which promotes my self-interest. So essentially, an egoist basically feels what is right is what's right for me, and what's wrong is something that's not beneficial to me. Okay, so it's a very selfish ethical perspective. Now, let's look at it, and it's a very unique ethical perspective in the sense that we don't typically think of ethics as simply looking out for self, right? So it kind of flips our traditional ideas of ethics on its head. Now, let's look at Hobbes' perspective on egoism in relation to the other philosophers we've talked about from this period. So, unlike Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, and sentimentalism, egoism, essentially, one of the key differences is that the egoist does not in any way give weight for consideration of the other when it comes to ethical matters, okay? If you think about it, Kantian ethics had an objective of trying to basically have a best outcome for all. Remember, Kant believed that all people were worthy of respect. If you think about utilitarian ethics, they considered the other at least a little bit. Yes, in utilitarian ethics, you may have to sacrifice some people, including yourself. However, there was still the bigger idea that we're looking for the greater good for the most amount of people, hence, the other is considered. And finally, in Smith's view of sentimentalism, you are definitely considering the other when we think of things like empathy, right? We're trying to put ourselves in the other's shoes or at least have some level of empathy and let our feelings guide us, okay? Now, that's a key difference because in egoism, the other is not a consideration, and actually, the other is seen as a potential detriment versus a good or something to be considered, okay? Now, although egoists are essentially focused on self, and therefore in a regular situation would not necessarily, their first thought would not be to help others. There are situations in which egoists will, in fact, actually consider the other or helping another. And that situation is when helping the other will actually work to their advantage. Okay, so they're helping the other, but they're essentially using the other as a means to their own end, which of course Kant would have an issue with. But for the egoist, this is the only way in which the other will possibly be considered if somehow the other is beneficial to me, because that's the main objective within egoist ethics, okay? So if you remember the example, the previous example we talked about, with someone volunteering in order to pad their resume or to make their resume look good. Where Kant would see this as problematic and not holding moral worth, yes, they did the right thing, but they did it for the wrong reason. The egoist might actually suggest that this is actually acceptable behavior because the end result is self promotion. So, therefore, yeah, I'll help these people out, I'll volunteer my time. But for the egoist, the only objective and the only reason it's considered ethical is because you're in the end actually helping yourself. Okay. So you can see the difference between how the egoist functions alongside the other ethical theories. All right. So what was motivating Hobbes, right? Hobbes had a unique view of human nature, okay? If you remember Kant's view of human nature, he thought people were reasonable, essentially, right? But Hobbes, his motivation was his motivation behind his egoist theory was basically based on how he viewed human nature. And Hobbes viewed humans as naturally selfish creatures with absolutely no self-control, and he felt that they would basically always act on their impulses, okay? So again, where Kant viewed people as possessing reason, and he felt that was the thing that essentially made us different than animals, Hobbes felt that we were essentially animals, right, at the end of the day, and that we didn't possess much reason, or at least the self-control in which to use reason. So, that being said, we are left with a question when we think about ethics and society and in general. How do we live amongst, if Hobbes is correct, right? How do we live amongst one another if all people truly are brutish and self interested, right? And we'll come to his answer to that question when we look at his political theory, which again is directly connected to his ethical ideas. So now let's talk about Hobbes on the idea of conscience, right? If you recall, when we talked about Smith, Smith argued that our conscience acts as an inner ruler or guide to help us basically have insight when it comes to the rightness or wrongness of an action, right? But Hobbes' view on conscience is that he didn't really trust it. Similar to how Descartes didn't trust our senses, Hobbes essentially does not trust our conscience, okay? And he has a very specific quote that addresses this. He says, "A man's conscience and his judgment is the same thing, and as the judgment, so also the conscience may be erroneous." Okay, so what he's pointing out here is that yeah, if in the last example we gave, I walk by someone who's really suffering, I may feel something inside. I may feel as if my conscience is telling me I need to act. But what Hobbes is saying, where Smith said, trust that feeling and go with it because that's ethics talking. Hobbes is essentially arguing that no, your conscience may tell you things, but your conscience may tell you things that are problematic or wrong or erroneous. So therefore, you shouldn't trust it, and you shouldn't necessarily trust that as your ethical judgment, okay? Instead, you should do what's best for you, even if it's in opposition to your conscience, okay? Now, one last thing about Hobbes' view of ethics, which is very interesting, was his view of women in ethics, okay? His view of women as it relates to ethical and technically his political theory becomes interesting because it was very rare at the time. Hobbes viewed all people, including women, as equal, and thus, in terms of the ability to do wrong or evil or being self interested, he essentially felt that they were just as capable of potentially dominating others through the practice of ethical egoism as anyone else, okay? And again, the reason this becomes interesting in relation to his ethics is because it was such a rare view during the early modern period where most thinkers of this time basically viewed women as weak and subordinate and not even worthy necessarily of ethical consideration so much as having ethical power to do anything one way or the other. All right. So now we have the key ideas of ethical egoism. We understand why Hobbes was motivated towards this view, and we have some of the key components, and we see how it's different from Kantian ethics, utilitarianism, and sentimentalism. But let's go back through some of the key thought experiments that we did with the other lectures and the other thinkers, and see how egoism plays a part. So we talked about the trolley problem when it came to utilitarianism, right? What would Hobbes and the egoists say in relation to the trolley problem, particularly the one where you had the option of killing your family member with a trolley or saving the five people, or saving, I shouldn't say it the other way around. We'll say it this way. Saving, we'll be optimistic, saving the five people versus saving your family member, okay? What would Hobbes do? Hobbes would say you have to do that which is most advantageous to self. Now, more than likely, that would give us an opportunity to justify if we decided to save our family member, right? Because that's most advantageous to me to save someone I care about. However, if there were even the slightest chance that somehow saving those five people would be beneficial to self, then Hobbes, an egoist, would actually go about saving those five people instead. Not because of the utilitarian idea that, well, you're saving more lives, but essentially, he would be doing it because of selfish reasons. If somehow these five people, like I said, would advance his own agenda in some way, shape, or form over his family member. So, just to give you perspective, sometimes you can have the exact same outcome, but you can have different reasons. So, in this, like I said, the utilitarian may say, hey, because it's five people, whereas the egoist may say, hey, these five people can advance my agenda, therefore, that's why I'm going to choose them. So the next case, we talked about the crazed axe murderer when it came to Kantian ethics, right? And Kant said, you know what? That axe murderer is basically deserving of the truth, right? He is worthy of respect too. The egoist, of course, here, Hobbes would essentially argue that no, you have to do what's in your own self interest here. And again, on the surface, it seems that that would be protecting our family. However, if somehow giving up your family would be, again, beneficial to you, then the true egoist would even sacrifice their family, tell the axe murderer the truth. But again, not because they think the axe murderer is worthy of the truth. The egoist doesn't care about the other person, right? However, they're doing it because it would somehow benefit them. Okay. So again, same outcome potentially, but different reasoning. And finally, we had the situation of the suicidal man that could not control his impulses. Okay. Of course, Kant would have a problem with this, as we talked about, because this man would be using himself as a means to an end, to end his own impulses. However, if we look at it from an egoist or Hobbesian perspective, essentially we had to give the same argument, right? That this man would have to do what's in his best interest. And in this particular case, it would actually be to not commit suicide. So he would agree there with Kantian ethics that this guy should not commit suicide. However, the reasoning is different, okay? And the reasoning for Kant is because you're using yourself as a means to an end and you're worthy of even respecting yourself. The reasoning for the egoist is by killing yourself, it's definitely not in your own best interest, right? One thing about the egoist is that most egoists, even outside of Thomas Hobbes, believe that the one thing you have, it kind of drives this idea of ethical egoism. The one thing that we genuinely truly have and own for ourselves is our own lives. So therefore, it part of the reason why we should function, why it is most advantageous and hence most ethical to function as egoists, is because by doing so assures the survival of the one thing you have, which is your own life. So thus, someone like Hobbes would absolutely clear cut be against this man committing suicide because simply ending your own life would not be in your best interest. Okay. Um, so boom. So now you can understand how the egoist works in application. The final point I want to make here is that, like I said, when we went through each and every one, we had an opportunity to see why reasoning for justifying your ethics becomes so important, right? Because two people, two theories from the same time frame can answer in the exact same way and say, hey, action A, B, and C is unethical or is ethical. However, by understanding the different philosophical perspectives, we can learn to justify our answer in a different way. So, if I had posed any of these situations to you prior to starting this unit, you may have given your answer and just said, well, because this feels right, or just given an answer but not quite been able to give a clear justification for why. Now, at the very end of this unit, my hope is that you can look at each of these scenarios or even the case studies, that we're going to be covering and be able to say, I believe this, and here's why I believe it, and this is a particular theory that actually supports my belief um, in this ethical stance. Okay. All right. So, in closing, we've covered four perspectives: Kantian, utilitarianism, sentimentalism, and egoism. Which do you align with? And even if you align with one over the other, can you still find some aspects of each of them that's essentially useful? If so, what do you find useful about each theory? These are things to think about for your closing writing assignment, okay? Which I'll talk about in a future lecture. And finally, if you're still unsure, if you're like, whoa, I kind of like all of them or I don't like any of them, don't worry. Our final lectures will actually be connecting all the dots and using case studies, which again I told you are essential to ethics. And basically, these will help you realize the ethical theories from the early modern period that works best for you, as well as putting it into practice. When it comes to ethical theory, the more you apply it to various different case studies, the better you understand the ideas, and they will help, hopefully, you lock the ideas into your mind for the final exam. All right. So that's it. As usual, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Until then, take care.